right, the next topic I want to talk about is typography. Now, I know a lot of students always say to me, but why do I need to learn about typography? I just open up Word, click the drop down, find Times New Roman, my favorite font, and then just put that on everything. It's done, right? Well, let's think about this. Now, let's say it's Valentine's Day and you decide that you want to write a letter to your beloved Valentine, and you change the font to something cursive like this. You'll always be mine. I don't know if she or he will be, but you have a good chance. Now, let's say that you chose the wrong font. That's a bit of a problem. Not only do I not think your Valentine is going to take very kindly to this, you might also have the police on your back, which is a bit of a problem. So fonts really do matter, and it's important to consider not only their mood, but also how to combine different fonts. And it's a really, really easy way to make your designs look very professional and really slick. Out of all of the fonts in the world, there's pretty much two large families that you should really know about. One is the serif family, where they have these little feet at the end of their central beams. And the reason why they have these little feet is because the serif typeface were inspired by the marble carvings of days of yore. So if you next go out and you take a look at the buildings around you, especially if you're in a historical area, take a look at places where they've carved into stone or marble. And you'll notice that they also have these little feet at the end of the central beams. So why is that? I don't know how many of you carve marble in your spare time, but if you did, you would know that once your chisel has gone into the rock and you need to exit your engraving, it's actually not possible to create 90-degree angles when you're carving into rock. So this is where the serif typeface gets their inspiration from. And this is also the reason why when you're choosing a serif typeface, you're making your design look more serious, more authoritative, and also a little bit older as well. So it's really good if you're designing something like a letterhead for a legal company or a magazine for architectural design. But when we take a look at the big family of serif typefaces, they're actually further subdivided into smaller subfamilies like old style, transitional, modern, and slab serif. Now, the really interesting thing is you can actually tell how old a typeface would look by looking at the difference between the thickest and the thinnest parts of each letter. So compare the old style O versus the transitional O versus the modern O, and look at how that difference between the thickest part of the letter and the thinnest part gets more and more exaggerated as you get towards a more modern font. So if you want something that looks authoritative but modern, then maybe you want to go for a modern serif typeface like Didot. But if you wanted to come across as a little bit older, a little bit more aged, maybe you have a winery, maybe you want to go for an old style serif instead. Now, just as different colors have different moods and emotions, different fonts also have different moods, and they also convey a different message to a user, depending on which one you choose. So the serif family generally come across as traditional, stable, respectable, authoritative. These are the words that get thrown around by designers when they're thinking about the serif typeface. So, for example, the next time you go to a magazine rack, pick up the Vogue magazine, take a look at their title and see how it's a modern serif typeface. It's got hugely exaggerated difference between the thick and thin parts of the lettering, and it looks authoritative and it knows what it's talking about. Now, on the other hand, if we think about the sans-serifs, they're kind of a different family, because instead of having the serifs or the little feet at the end of the central beams, they have perfect right angles. And it's this right angle that makes the sans-serif family look so much more friendly, more approachable, more novel and more contemporary. So, for example, you will tend to get words like sensible, simple, straightforward. And this is why a lot of startups love using the sans-serif typeface in their websites. For example, a humanist typeface, which is a subfamily of the sans-serifs, is something that is known as a highly readable typeface. And in fact, even within the serif and the sans-serifs, you'll tend to see designers going for the sans-serifs if they want to write body text, which needs to be more legible and more readable. Now, within this subfamily, there's even differences in terms of legibility and readability. So how easy are the words to read, and how pleasant is it to read the letters? There was a really interesting study done by MIT a few years back, where they took two groups of users. One, they put them into a car which had a dashboard made of a humanist typeface. And the other car had a dashboard which had a grotesque sans-serif typeface. And what they did is they tracked the pupils of the people who were driving the cars, and they tested how long each driver needed to look down at the dashboard before they got enough information from the speedometer or the odometer, and before they could come back and look at the road again. And really surprisingly, they found that just by changing the font from a grotesque sans-serif to a humanist sans-serif, they could save the drivers somewhere around 30 to 40% of the time that's required to understand the information. So imagine if that car is on a freeway that's driving at 60 miles, 100 miles an hour. That difference in the amount of time the user needs to look down at the dashboard could be the difference between life and death. And as designers, we rarely get to make that kind of difference in the world, right? So knowing that the humanist typeface, all of the fonts that belong in that category, like Jill Sans, Tahoma, Vedana, these are highly readable and highly legible fonts, which you can use in the body text, for example, of your sales pitch. Now, even though we're not saving lives with our sales pitches, if you manage to get the user to read through more of your sales copy, then they're probably going to be more convinced and more likely to buy your product, right? So readability and legibility when you're choosing fonts is incredibly important. And the things that you're looking for in the letters when you're looking for legibility are open shapes and a lot of space between each of the letters. And also the forms look unambiguous, so they look different. For example, here the G and the 9 actually look different on the second line. And finally, varying proportions. So having an O that's very wide and a 0 that's a bit more narrow, so you can actually tell the difference between the two. Now, while we've talked about using fonts, it's often that you see people go a bit overboard, where they choose 10 fonts in the same design. And that makes your design look very cluttered and very unprofessional. I recommend actually sticking to just 2 fonts in one design. So if you're making a poster, keeping that to 2 fonts. If you're making a section of your website, keeping that again to 2 fonts. It just looks a lot cleaner and a lot tighter. And when you're combining these 2 different fonts, you want to try to go for similar moods. So find fonts that have a similar mood to each other and also a similar time era. You don't want something that looks ultra modern with something that looks like it's from the days of yore combined together. It looks a little bit weird. Now, the things you want to contrast are the serifness. So for example, you want the heading to be a serif and the body to be a sans serif, or the opposite way round. It just creates more interest in your design. And similarly, you can also create interest by just changing up the weights between the heading and the body. So making the heading really, really bold, or even using a black typeface, and making the body text using something like thin or regular or light. These different weights can create contrast in your design. Now, if you don't remember anything from this talk on typefaces, I just want you to look at these 6 fonts and try to wipe them from your memory, because it is very, very difficult to make these designs look good. Unless, I guess, if you're running a lemonade stand. But if you want to look professional, if you want to look designed, try to use one of the other fonts that we've talked about and try to ignore these ones which are difficult to read and have moods that are difficult to fit in a professional setting. The next time you're designing your website, think about what typefaces you're going to choose. Think about what you're trying to convey with those typefaces, and then pick a font from the sans-serif or the serif family, and maybe try to combine them so you have a heading that's a sans-serif and a body that's a serif, and try to create contrast in your designs. So keep this in mind, and hopefully that will make your designs a lot more interesting and a lot more professional.